This is Outside of New York, in-depth discussions with members of the art world who live and work outside of New York. And here's your host, Craig Gould.
Sara Cardona is a Dallas-based artist who creates abstract collages and reliefs. These pieces, which often evoke organic shapes and forms, draw inspiration from colors and textures found in a diverse variety of media. Originally from Mexico City, Sara has spent the majority of her life in and around Dallas. After graduating from Booker T. Washington High School for the Performing and Visual Arts in Dallas, she spent a year at Kansas City Art Institute before receiving her bachelor's from the University of Texas in Austin. Sara later received her MFA from Temple University's Tyler School of Art and completed a residency at the renowned Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. She is currently completing a PhD in Aesthetic Studies from the University of Texas at Dallas. And after 15 years of teaching arts-related courses at Richland College, Sara recently took on an art administration role at Teatro Dallas. Her work is consistently included in solo and group exhibitions throughout Texas, and she is represented in Dallas by Kirk Hopper Fine Art. I recently sat down with Sara at her home studio in Oak Cliff, where we discussed growing up in a family of creatives, returning to one's roots, carving out time for one's craft, the evolving art scene in Dallas, Bangladeshi movie posters, and her grandfather's relationship with Diego Rivera. Sara, I really appreciate you being willing to sit down and talk.
Yeah. Oh, this is super exciting.
Yeah. Well,
cool. No one's ever asked me that.
Yeah. Well, I came across your work, Kirk Hopper, and I really loved your work. I think it's really interesting, and read some more about your background, and I just figured there are some really interesting stories there.
Yeah.
It looks like you've had a really interesting path.
Yeah.
Just from what I can see, and just thought it would be interesting to sit down and have a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I understand that you come from a long line of creatives.
Yes.
So maybe that would be a good place to start.
Sure. Well, I guess principally, starting with my parents, they were both they both founded a theater here in Dallas, and then before that in Austin, but generally involved in theater and film. And I have a sister who is a professional actress in New York.
Wow.
So we kind of really grew up mainly with theater and film as a background, although there are other members of the family who are writers and artists, and so my mom jokingly calls it like a genetic deficit, because she's like, we can't seem to produce pragmatic people who might want to be a doctor or an engineer,
right.
All those kind of things that people aspire to.
There's no fun in that.
There's no fun in that. And but I think the flip side of that is that we have lots of really good models in our family of working artists.
Right.
No one's a millionaire, but we all understand that it's a viable profession, and that you have your ups and downs and all of that. But so I see, you read artist biographies, and it's always like the struggle of the parents didn't want them to do that, or they didn't accept that. And luckily, I didn't really have that. I mean, I think they always were very supportive. And one of my earliest jobs, for example, my dad, I think he was just trying to save money, right. But he took me with him as like a grip, So when I was about 15 or 16, I started going with him. He's a gaffer. He does lighting.
Wow.
And so he would, teach me like, that's an apple crate. That's a Fresnel. That's a big boy. And I'd like carry stuff around. And it was really fun being on set. And that got me interested in the art department. And I went to Booker T. Washington here.
Sure.
And at that time, they let you kind of split what we called split cluster. Like you could do a little theater, you could do a little art. So I gravitated towards the visual arts more because it suited my disposition to sort of work more solo. But I think somehow all of that kind of theatrical sort of stuff and cinema has always been in the background and kind of informed my work in different ways.
Okay.
So it's kind of been an important part of the imagery.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So you grew up in, if you went to Booker T, that means you grew up in Dallas proper, or?
Pretty much. I mean, so I was born in Mexico City and moved to Texas in grade school and to Dallas in almost 9th grade or end of 8th grade. So I went to high school here and lived a few doors down in here in Oak Cliff. So I've gone around other places. I lived in San Francisco for a while, in Philadelphia, but I came back. And so literally now I'm practically back to the roots because I'm just like, 500 feet away or 1,000 feet away from, the house that I kind of grew up in terms of being here in Dallas.
Sure.
But yeah, I've been part of, I feel like Texas is my true home as a way. And I've seen it go through all these different incarnations. And it's a funny town. I feel like Dallas is the city, at least when we moved here, it always had that sort of stigma of like, oh, Dallas, like it's not a place that was a destination place.
Right.
And so strangely, I think the people who lived here were more invested in it and really put a lot of energy into the arts community and really worked it,
Sure.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure you can see a big difference in how that relates to this neighborhood, this part of Oak Cliff now versus when you were growing up. I mean, it's beginning to be kind of the center of arts. Arts. It's one of the neighborhoods that's kind of building an identity around the arts, right?
Yes, I think that in general, up until very recently, cities in Texas have been really great places in terms of space for artists. Like you can get a little gunshot house, you can, and have space to work. Now, I think the changes that are happening are a little disconcerting because, for example, and I really love all the things that are happening in the art scene. I think it's expanded so much more than obviously what was here 20 years ago or 25 years ago. But in other ways, it's contracted in the sense that, like, when I went to high school, what is now the Dallas Contemporary was D-Art. And then it went through some incarnations and it became sort of the center for contemporary art.
Right.
But over that time period, like the MAC and D-Art and there's always been 500X, but like, the Continental Gen, all these spaces, there were actually more spaces showing local artists.
Right.
And strangely, though we have far more new galleries, the actual spaces for artists who are local, who maybe not generating the kind of work that may be sellable or get, what I'm saying? Those have shrunk a little bit. So there are a lot of artists living in Oak Cliff. They're also experiencing getting pushed out a little bit.
Right.
And like in the Bishop Arts District, which has that name Arts attached to it, but actually there aren't a lot of artists or galleries,
right.
So it's a weird phenomenon that I see happening in Dallas. But then again, I see a lot of artists who are so committed to being here that they're very involved at, getting involved with like the Arts Commission and city politics and things to try to really advocate to not lose that. you know.
Sure.
So, because I think a good city has a balance of like wonderful galleries and museums and all of that, and, you know, contemporary centers, but we also need things that are driven by the artists. And so I've seen Oak Cliff change a lot, and I, you know, because I had lived in other parts of Dallas and moved back.
Right.
One of the reasons I came back here is just because of the community is here. They do live around here, like, you know, and it's nice to go down to the coffee shop or something and bump into people. But I also get worried that it's getting so expensive that people are having to, you know, exit.
That's the story. I mean, that's the story associated with artists wherever they go, right?
Right.
I mean, just, you know, gentrification follows art. You know, people love what people who develop communities, you know, kind of piggyback on what artists have brought to a community, right? And then by the time they come in and, you know, capitalize on that, they've priced the artist out of that community.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I think actually, because there's a whole talk right now in Dallas, and they've had lots of meetings with artists about writing this new cultural policy and like sustaining an arts ecosystem for Dallas. And I think that is, for visual artists, one of the primary things is affordable housing and space.
Right.
Because if you don't have those things in the mix, then, you know, it's top down. It's not. Yeah. So I completely think you're right. It's an age old. Right. You know. Yeah. We're good for the developers. We want the developers to be good to us.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So. Yeah.
So when you left Booker T, did you go? I saw that you went to Kansas City. Is that straight out of high school?
Yep, that was my first year. You know, I was like, I think from really young, just determined that I wanted to be an artist. Like, that's what I wanted to do. Right. And so I went to the Art Institute, which was great. But it was a very weird year. The year I got there was like, I was staying in the dorm, and we had like 12 feet of snow or something. Not that much, but a crazy amount. Right. And it was just very overwhelming for me to be isolated. Actually, very hard for me to make art. I mean, it was a great program. So the second year, I came back and I ended up going to UT Austin, and I think it just fit me personally better because I needed the visual arts, but I actually, as an individual, really felt like sometimes the art. At least then, the art schools were, you know, it's all mostly concentrated on the studio stuff. And things have changed so much now. But I loved being at UT because you could take classes from, you know, different departments, and it was just a little bit more amplified and easier to navigate. Like, it just doesn't snow like that there. Sure.
Well, I mean, that's the difference between an art-specific school versus a university environment, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the range of options that are available to you it's far more broad. I mean, did you you know, what about this, you know, the size difference in, you know, versus going to school at some place like the Arts Institute at Kansas City versus UT, because UT is
ginormous.
Yeah.
That, I mean, it is a little bit of a shock, but actually I think because I was even, you know, back then, like, I'm living in a big city, so Kansas City was lovely, but I was already used to, like, you know, I didn't drive a lot in high school, but I was riding the DART bus everywhere, and we didn't even have the train, and it was like, I was already much more urban. And Kansas City was actually a contraction for me. It felt very hard because I didn't have a car. I was staying in a dorm, and just psychologically, I think I always just, you know, even when I was young, I grew up in Mexico City. I needed to be able to, like, get out and walk around and do a lot of things, and that, because so much of my artwork actually isn't generated by me. It just comes from material out in the world, and so I didn't understand that quite at that time. But so being at UT, actually being at a big school, didn't bother me really. And I went through a program called Plan 2 that was the classes were actually really small. They were like seminar, you know, like 12 people in the class. So I benefited from, like, being in a small program at a big
Sure.
big university, it was like the best of both worlds for me.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so